As I think about like the future of leadership, it's really that leaders are in that position to listen and learn and get away from, I have the answer, let me give it to you, to either we co-create the answer or, I create an environment where you can come up with the answer. We have to sort of keep that focus on the people while we're trying to figure out what this next way of working looks like. We don't have the answers. We have not seen this movie before. We don't know how it ends.
Welcome back to another episode of Connected Conversations. This one is long overdue, in my opinion. I am very excited to have somebody who I consider a real leader in the corporate real estate industry, somebody who leads by example, and somebody whose content I've had the pleasure of enjoying over the last 3 years or so. And it's just really a great opportunity to finally have the time to sit down and talk to Robert Teed today. Robert, how are you?
I'm great, and I'm super excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me in.
So Robert, a lot of us in the industry, I want to start here because I didn't kind of include it, but a lot of us in the industry know you very well. From, kind of your presentations, your background, some of the places you've worked at. What are you doing today?
I kind of come at the work I'm doing today with this idea that I'm kind of a recovering corporate real estate executive. So where that brings me today is I do a lot of work around what I would consider executive coaching, some strategic advisory, and a little bit of consulting. And all of that is around how we are shifting our relationship with the workplace. So, I come at it with that experience of sort of creating the workplace. Now I'm really focused on how the people experience the workplace and really focusing on the hearts and minds of the people within the workplace.
So what's the name of your company?
Yes, Integri Group. Thank you for asking. I didn't plug it, but yes, Integri Group.
It's right there, right above you. That's how I knew how to ask it.
That's right.
Very good. So how I start these off, and that I wanted to do that because I know there's been, a shift in kind of your professional world, if you will. But take us back. What's your statement of qualification? Take us as far back as you'd like. Kind of how did Robert Teed get to where he is today?
Yeah, so thank you for that. I like I mentioned, I've been in and around workplace really my entire career. It's been about 3 decades of different versions and different flavors of workplace. But if you sort of go all the way back to the beginning of my career, which was started in the late 80s, my very first roles somehow, some way always involved the built environment. And so I spent most of my career sort of focused on the built environment. What shifted for me probably about 10 years ago was this focus on moving to less about the built environment, less about the buildings being the customer, if you will, to more about employee experience and focusing on what was happening in the buildings, how the people were interacting with that experience. And so, that entire 3 decades has been around the built environment. But there's been sort of a shift, if you will, within that. How I got into the sort of corporate real estate space was simply by accident. I didn't necessarily go to school for it. I didn't expect to be in this. I kind of fell into it, but I fell in love with it. And it's really been where I've put all of my attention, my professional attention for the last 3 decades.
I just wrote it down. That's what I leaned down to write down. What you just said, I started the same way, very focused on the built environment. One of my first projects that got me into corporate real estate and facilities was a new HQ construction. Mm-hmm. And my part of that was moving everybody from the old site to the new site, working on small little construction projects within the construction project. So I was very focused on that ground up construction. Mm-hmm. The people were a task, if you will. I hate to put it that way. Mm-hmm. You have to move these people from here to there, make sure their stuff gets there and get it done on time. Mm-hmm. But what you just said was you took an approach where it went from the built environment to more focused on how the people interact within the ecosystem in the world, that built environment. Where did that, because now that's what people are talking about now, Robert, mm-hmm. But it sounds like you started contemplating this long before this shift to the human-centric workplace.
Yeah. And I wish I could put like a fine point on this was the epiphany for me, but it really was a process. Right. And what I was finding, quite honestly, is that, we were creating these really, I'm in the heart of the Silicon Valley. I've had many opportunities to create what I would consider very cool, progressive, modern workplaces. Yeah. But what I started to find, honestly, is that didn't necessarily lead to great employee engagement and great employee experience. So we were so focused on, getting the physical environment right. We were sort of missing on many occasions, sort of getting the experience right. So somewhere a decade ago, I started to get heavily involved working with sort of chief people officers and mm-hmm. CHROs, and my lens completely shifted. I started to see the built environment through the eyes of the employees. Yeah. And so not a single moment, but it was a process. And once I started to see it that way, I realized that the built environment has a really important role. It's just probably a different role than I was thinking for the previous couple of decades.
Yeah. I just, to be able to shift that mindset. And again, I probably come from a little different world, where the people that I reported to were very much people who maybe started as groundskeepers or started mm-hmm. as wrench turners mm-hmm. or have a pure construction type background. And this leads me into what I would like you to talk about today, where you were able to make that mind shift, because I think my take is you're a very empathetic person who listens and then acts. You're an active listener, right? You're somebody who listens and then puts that into action. And to me, that's a trait of a really good leader. So as for the theme for this podcast, it's back to the future. Let's focus on the future. We've been through this global traumatic event. We know things have changed. We know there's different working models and things like that. But when I look at you, I see somebody who's truly a leader. So if you could talk a little bit, and this is where we will go over the course of our conversation, what does the future of leadership look like to you with all those lessons you've learned, and then taking into account what just happened over the last couple of years?
Yeah, thank you by the way, I appreciate those warm words. And yeah, thank you. It's interesting. I think the future of leadership is really around some of the words that you referenced about me. It's really leading with empathy. It's really thinking about the people that we're leading. And I come at this probably through two lenses. One is I believe truly in coach leadership and servant leadership, and they can be a little bit different. Okay. But the whole idea is that we put the person or the people at the center of the work that we're doing. So as leaders, we're here to serve the people, mm-hmm. Not the other way around. And so that evolution was happening well before the pandemic.
Correct.
What the pandemic helped unleash, I believe, is these deep wells of empathy and compassion in leaders, because frankly, there was no choice. People were put into these really precarious situations. People were suffering. There was a lot going on that called on leaders to be empathetic and compassionate. And if you weren't, you stood out like a sore thumb, and your folks that you were serving and supporting and leading would suffer. And so I think the future of leadership really unfolded before our eyes over the last couple of years. And I think it's these deep wells of empathy and compassion. As I think about, where does that go? Those wells could dry up. And frankly, I think we're starting to see hints of some of that potentially happening. The work that I do now is to really try to keep many of the leadership lessons that we've learned over the last few years alive and well, and carrying them into the future, so that we continue to have a focus on the people and not lose that. Business is important. We're all in the business of business, but business without people just doesn't exist. And so we've got to make this about the people.
Right. So there's a couple things you said there Servant leadership, yes, I've seen that. I've heard a friend of mine, Samantha Fisher, right? She talks about that a lot from Okta. She talks about servant leadership. And Robert, it's one of those things I saw on LinkedIn that I'd never heard that term before, and I had to go look it up to understand. And I've been certainly guilty of seeing something and then misusing the term. But servant leadership, number one, agree wholeheartedly. And I truly feel that's something that came out of the pandemic that's necessary. And I feel like people can do better at that, quite frankly, especially in the smaller companies and especially some folks who maybe been in their positions for a long time, that they could benefit from looking to some guidance from a Robert Teed on how he's been able to do that to kind of be better at that servant leadership. But the other part you mentioned that I would like you to touch on a little more is being a coach. I played sports growing up, and I love the aspect of a team, and I have no problem having people coach me up. Even Fred, who produces his podcast, I bring something to him and he tells me why it won't work. And then he says it would work in this way, but not this way. And he's coaching me. So talk a little bit how you approach coaching people.
Yeah. And so this idea of coach leadership is similar in servant leadership, is that it's all about the person. And you can coach teams, and you can sort of incorporate that approach into how you manage, big numbers of people. But the idea is it's really about the individual. And it's, one of the things that's shifted for me as I've, really sort of become more of this coach leader, and now I'm actually an executive coach, is this idea that every single person we work with has a ton of potential in them. Every single person has talent, strengths, things that we can leverage. And my job is not to necessarily direct them on what to do. It's really to help them unleash those talents and strengths.
Yeah.
And that takes time, and that takes a little bit of a different process and approach. And so for so many years, we were so, as senior leaders, we were so used to directing, giving answers, really sort of making sure that our voices were heard. When you shift into this coach leadership approach, it's more about the other voices. It's more about, you mentioned active listening, right? Or listening. It's much more about listening to others and helping them be the best they can be at something. And that's really absent of advice and direction. It's really more about helping them sort of navigate their own journey. It sounds a little, I realize that sounds a little like up in the clouds. I can talk about how that shows up in practice, but that's really how I think the big approach of coach leadership is starting to unfold. And that's how I really approach my own coaching work.
So let me ask you this. This brings up a fantastic thought in my head, kind of something we were discussing before the podcast, is how you apply coaching to different generations in the workplace or wherever. I'm sure you coach people outside the workplace as well, but how do you apply it to say, how would you approach a millennial versus a Gen Xer or baby boomer or any of those generations that are in the workplace today? How do you tackle that?
Yeah, it's, whilst there's a lot of generational differences in the workplace, I think we're at 5 generations in the workplace. And there's a lot of different context that, comes with those experiences or lack of experiences. The way you coach isn't necessarily that different, though. It's often practicing a lot of listening, active inquiry. Sometimes with folks that are a little earlier in career, you might have to do a little bit more what I call context coaching, which is give them a little bit of shape to the challenge or issue that they're working with. Yeah. And if you're an executive coach versus sort of a coach manager or coach leader where those people report to you, those approaches can be quite different. So as an executive coach, for example, I may not give as much of that context, but if I'm managing somebody and I'm trying to coach them, I may give a little bit more context or a few nudges here and there, but still practicing this idea of, my job isn't to tell you what to do. My job isn't to give you the answer. My job is to help you get to the answer that is best for you, that you think is right. and to really help you harness those things. And really it's this idea of let me, I could certainly lead you to water and drink for you, right? That
Right.
analogy. Or I can teach you, or I can let you learn it as you go. And that's really the idea behind coaching, is to make you better at learning and make you better at figuring out your challenges and issues on your own, and giving you that support versus me just giving you the answer every single time.
I run into that a lot as well, because I'm at a point in my career where I like to work with the younger generation, particularly in sales, in marketing. Again, I can learn a lot from the next generation of marketers because things have changed from a content creation standpoint. And I learn from them as well. But what I like to do is I like to tell stories. I'll tell a story of, that project I was referencing earlier in our conversation that I started with. I was like, this is what happened. This is what I saw happening. This is how I mitigated the risk. And then this was the outcome. And I hope what that does is it's not just a fun way for me to tap into a fond memory or something that I learned from. We never learn from our successes. We learn from our failures, right? So I like to talk about that a lot. And it's a good way for me to, tap into my past and then lead by example. So I don't, again, like I would look to somebody who is an executive coach or somebody coaching a younger generation to set the example.
Yeah.
And so I was going to ask you, how do you go about setting the example?
Yeah. And it's different. This whole idea of coaching and the way I've approached it, I've done it both as a external coach, which is what I'm doing now.
Right.
But even for the last decade or so, as I've led teams and in the work that I've done, I've embraced this idea of being a coach leader or a coach manager. And so the way you do it when somebody's directly reporting to you, again, it's a little different than when you're an external coach. But the idea is to, what you just described, is to sort of create sort of storytelling narratives, lead by example, so that you're sort of sharing experiences without directly telling somebody how to do it. Right. And that's really powerful, because you're letting people come to their own conclusion based on all these different inputs. And a big chunk of that input may be your example or storytelling.
Yeah.
As a third party coach or external coach, sometimes you don't give as much of that narrative or storytelling. But when people are reporting directly to you, that approach can be really powerful. And then again, you're letting them come to their own conclusion or come to their own answer, and come to you with that answer or that conclusion. And, maybe sometimes they need to validate that with you, or they need to make sure they're on the right track, but they're the ones that are coming to you with that.
Exactly. Because I have one of our leaders here at Nuvolo. Whenever I'm talking to somebody and they have to bring something to him, I'm like, bring 3 solutions or bring your solution to him. Don't bring him the problem. If you bring him 3 solutions, or you've already prepared, what you want to present, that's going to get you much further than just showing up. Well, man, I just don't know what to do here. You know?
Yeah. And if that leader is using some of these coaching tools or approaches that we're talking about, their first question after hearing those 3 solutions would be, I don't know, Bob, what do you think? What do you think the right answer is? Yes. Right. So it's they may even, in the back of their mind, they may know what they think the right answer is, but they may learn something really powerful from that individual that's coming to them to say, here's the 3 solutions. Here's what I think the right answer is. And then all of a sudden you're like, you're right. Wow, that's a great answer.
I like what you just said there about not just the person bringing the problems and the solutions, but the leader learning something and having that humility to say, I can learn something from this analyst, this person who's a couple steps down from me in the org chart. I can learn something from them. And I think that's the trait of a good leader too, is to never approach things from an open mind and saying, I'm going to help this person along the way, but maybe I can learn something from them.
Yeah. And if you sort of zoom out on that and say, well, what are we going through right now as we sort of define, the next way of working or the future of work? It's exactly that. It's not that the leader has the answer any longer, because so much has changed. And so we're all in this mode of I don't know, Bob, what do you think the right answer is? Right.
Yeah. Figure it out. And we had a podcast. We had a podcast with an author, Kelly. She works for Kelly Cologne. She works for Steelcase. You probably know her. And one of the things she was talking about that kept coming up, she was doing these interviews with people during the pandemic and all these things that they were going through. And it was like, I have to figure this out. I went through that in my own personal life. I had something I needed to figure out in relation to my elderly father. I had to figure out a solution for him that was going to, keep him healthy through a pandemic that was targeting his demographic. So what you just said there was really impactful because it's real. I'm living proof of that. There's a lot of stuff over the last couple of years that we just had to figure out. And maybe certain people that you looked up to, maybe they didn't have the answer. And it's like, maybe they could have learned something bidirectionally from somebody else that's a subordinate to them. But you have to be receptive to that, Robert.
Totally. Yeah. And that's as I think about like the future of leadership, sort of back to where we started, it's really that leaders are in that position to listen and learn, and get away from, I have the answer, let me give it to you. Yeah. To either we co-create the answer. Love it. Or, I create an environment where you can come up with the answer. Because again, I mean, we're and Kelly was spot on. It's like, we're in this really squishy time. I call it the messy middle, right? We're sort of moving from one thing to a new thing.
We are. And, yes.
Yeah. And it's not happening with a light switch. And so how we lead our way through that, how we learn our way through that, I think is going to be really important. And I hope those are lessons we've learned over the last couple of years. There's been a lot of learning, experimenting, trial and error. We didn't quite know how to be as empathetic and compassionate as we suddenly showed up as being. It just sort of luckily, not luckily, it's not the right way to say it, but those wells were there. We just tapped them. Yeah. And so, we had that empathy and compassion sort of platform that really served us well while people were in these really precarious situations. Carrying that forward, we have to sort of keep that focus on the people while we're trying to figure out what this next way of working looks like, which requires leaders to be humble, requires, willingness to listen, to continue to experiment, and to realize we don't have the answers. We have not seen this movie before. We don't know how it ends. And so we've got to really stay as agile in our thinking, in our approach as possible. And I think that includes the way we lead people.
I can't agree with you more in terms of what you were saying. What I always say is there's no user manual for this. In my own personal life, I beat myself up some days, Robert, where I'm just like, man, I didn't do a good job today. I lost my cool. I didn't handle that with as much grace and leadership, if you will. I didn't lead me and my father, my family to the right solution in the best possible. We got there, but and I have to take a step back and say, Bob, you've never done this before. It's like, there's no owner's manual. There's no user's manual. There's no place on YouTube I can Google how to do this. So I couldn't agree with you more on that. And then the other thing, what I look for out of these podcasts, Robert, is coming up with nuggets. And you gave me one of the nuggets just then. And you said it probably without even thinking about it. Let's co-create the solution. I love that because I played sports growing up. On the podcast, I have Fred who helps me. I love being in a collaborative team. There's other people behind the scenes who help with the podcast. I love that. So co-creating solutions, and that term co-create, I think, is something that can really be leveraged moving forward. And it doesn't feel like a buzzword to me. And we always talk about the buzzword fatigue, and we have a no buzzword policy on this podcast, but let's co-create what the future looks like. Love it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, if you really want to listen to what your employees need, and you want to, and we can talk about employee experience a little bit, but if you really want to get that right for your employees and for your company, and sort of make sure those two interests are served well. That co-creation approach is in my experience, as a good one, and is definitely one that I hope continues forward.
I love it. So now I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. So again, when I was thinking about what I wanted to do for season 2 of this podcast, again, what it was to me was picking subject matter experts in a certain lane of what they do and how it applies to the workplace, corporate real estate, and the world that we're in today. We had one person who is from the commercial brokerage side. We had another person from marketing. We're going to get another person from a research, from one of the furniture companies who leads their research and analytics team. But when I thought about you, you're a bit of a Swiss Army knife, right? I could pick 5 topics and I could talk to you about 5 different topics. But the reason why I chose you to speak about leadership is I was looking through LinkedIn one day and I saw a post. And that post was, in the event of the recent layoffs, I would like to offer anybody in my network a copy of this book that I find valuable to help repoint you on your career, your goals, and things of that nature. That post was done by you. And to me, that's an example of leading the industry, leading your peers, leading your former colleagues, and actually doing something, taking action. And I found that to be very admirable. And that's why I reached out and said, I would really like to speak to you about leadership. So I commend you for doing that. You didn't ask me to talk about this. Again, I'm putting you on the spot. I'm sorry if it's a little embarrassing because I know it came from a place of truly caring. What gave you that idea? Who did you learn something like acting by doing? Instead of just saying, I'm here for you, you did something. Where does that come from?
Yeah, and thank you for acknowledging that, and I appreciate that. And where it came from is a place of caring and also a bias towards action. And I found I found myself over the last couple of years in this place where I'm sort of trying to help shape a lot of things. And trying to take action on how I shape those. And a lot of that I do one-on-one through the coaching work and my advisory work and things like that. So that there's some action towards that. But when you look at something that's happening at scale, like reductions and layoffs and these big changes, I was trying to find a way where I could take action and be helpful and be caring without it just being words. Like, I do think there's a lot of folks out there that can offer very inspiring words and that can be very helpful. But I do think there's a lot of that isn't necessarily action oriented. So I wanted to make sure I was being helpful in an action oriented way towards the folks that were impacted. And, that was the best solution I could think of in the moment was to say, look, this is a practice area where I've gotten a lot of benefit from. Yeah. It's a really powerful book. I think when people do get impacted, like, the layoffs we're seeing, it's an opportunity to really figure out what you want to do next, what you want to love, what you love doing, and how do you do more of it. And so, the thing that I was able to come up with in the moment was, well, let me do this. And if I can be helpful to one person that I don't already know and work with, then it's probably worth it.
Yeah. Yeah. And to me, that's real leadership. And again, I jotted down another nugget, a bias towards action, right? Let's co-create the solution. Let's have a bias towards action. Again, these are the nuggets I take away. That's probably going to be the name of the podcast, Bias Towards Action with Robert Teed. I think it's a fantastic tagline, because at the end of the day, I find a lot of things that people nowadays think are action are inaction. Like what you just did solved nothing, right? And it comes down to people who, again, what we go back to, leading by example. To me, that's setting the example that I hope somebody else, when something crops up down the line and they view themselves as a leader, take action. Do something. Words are just words. And especially in the social media world, and where certain words will, stoke the algorithm a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
To me, spending that money on people who you don't even know. In some cases, it may be somebody who's a friend of yours where I reach out and say, yeah, I'd love a copy of that book. It could be somebody you don't know. To me, that's real. That's empathy. That's somebody who's really trying. And it's just a great example of leadership, which leads me to this question is, who did you learn from? Who were your mentors?
Yeah, it's a great question. I have to think about that a little bit if I go way back, because I've a lot of what sort of helped shape my leadership is things not to do that I've learned from others, to be quite honest. But if you fast forward, I've had this really great opportunity to work with some amazing human-centric leaders in the last 10 years. And I'd say two of them that I would call out, both were I was able to work with at ServiceNow. One was Pat Waters, who was our CHRO, and just an amazing human-centric leader. And I learned an awful lot from her. And one of the main things that she did for me was give me permission to be a human-centric leader. Right. I've been doing this a long time. In the first, couple of decades, it really wasn't about emotion and feeling in the workplace. It was about, work, leave all the feeling stuff at the door. And, I didn't feel that way. I felt like, wait a minute, let's bring our whole selves to work. Let's make sure, all parts of our lives are sort of incorporated into the work that we're doing. But I was sort of alone in a lot of that. Working with Pat, I recognized that I wasn't alone, that there is this whole community out there that does feel that way. So Pat was really influential for me in that. And then the other leader, I just think the world of is John Donahoe, who's the current CEO at Nike. He was our CEO at ServiceNow for several years. And the same thing, when I think of compassionate, empathetic leaders who put people first, John is the first CEO I think of. And it's not that he doesn't think about the business at all. It is that he thinks about the business, but he thinks about it through the eyes of employees. If I can make employees the best they can be, the business will be the best it can be.
You said that at the beginning of the podcast. Yeah. I mean, your message is very clear. Mm-hmm. It's very clear.
Yeah. So those two, I would say, are probably the most influential. And then, like I said, a lot of learning what not to do from leaders that I've worked with. And that's not fair of all of them, but there's certainly some that have not been people-centric, have been very business-centric, and people kind of get in the way. And I've done my absolute best to not let that sort of come into the way I lead.
And I couldn't agree with you more, because coming up in the sales world, right, you get a lot of leaders who are really good at selling, right? And they matriculate their way up to the head of sales. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, most of the time, the people I interacted with necessarily didn't also have those soft skills of, let me start this conversation before I ask Bob about his pipeline. Let me ask Bob about, how he's doing. Maybe I was out with a sickness, or I was dealing with a personal matter or something. Mm-hmm. Ask me about that. And so many times I was so let down when I got off a phone call and my manager talked at me, talked my ear off, and then said, okay, that's it, and hung. I remember one time in particular where I was like, don't you want to hear about my week? And he's like, I don't have time. Just put something on my calendar. And I was like, and I learned from that, Robert, to where, one, I won't be that way. Number two, I'll never approach him that way again. Every time I reach out to this person, it'll be about my pipeline. Every email will be bullet point lists about what's going on, and call it a day. Yeah. That's sad.
It is. And I think that's one of the byproducts of the pandemic has been there's less of what you just experienced, hopefully, and more of, let me start the conversation with what's going on in Bob's life, because more than likely there's an awful lot going on in your life that is going to influence the work that you're doing. I need to understand it. I need to support you as a person in order for you to do your work. And so that there is that shift. And I do really hope, and I'm super optimistic that what has been unleashed, those wells of empathy and compassion that have been tapped, will stay tapped and will continue to sort of, carry that forward. Because it used to be kind of weird, honestly, for me to say, hey, what's going on in your personal life?
Yes.
We wouldn't do that. Now it's
Yeah.
like, as you just said, it's like, if we don't do that, we have this really weird reaction. Like, well, he didn't even ask me how I'm doing.
Yeah. And it's also, I was explaining this to Fred the other day, how LinkedIn has changed, like that LinkedIn, the social platform itself has changed to where I was like, well, I'll share this article because it pertains to, what I'm selling or what I'm doing in this point in time. And it was very I remember I shared a picture once. I was on a business trip and I was like, let me share this picture. And I was like, oh, I don't know. But now it's kind of become a little more, let me talk about what's going on in my personal life. Sometimes it could go too far. But it's kind of changed to where, people are sharing more about their experiences. And then you have Kelly who goes off and writes a whole book about it. Maybe 5 years ago, she wouldn't have done that. And to your point, it's becoming this thing where it's okay to turn on the option to turn on your camera. I've used all these platforms. It's always been there. And I was always thinking, like, we don't ever turn our cameras on. And now we do. And people's dogs are in the shot, or a kid's crying, or something's going on. In my case, my dad's snoring in the background or something. And it's like, people are now empowered to share that aspect. And that's what we also try to do on the podcast. I want to hear about your background. What makes you tick? What are these kind of, what makes Robert Teed Robert Teed? So.
Yeah. It makes me think of two sort of stories. One is, I don't know, it was probably 17, 18 when the newscaster was doing a live broadcast and his kids came in. Yes. And his wife came in. I don't know if you remember that one, but at the time it was like, oh my gosh, the kid came in the little walking thing, and the mom falls through the door. Right.
Yep.
Yeah. So you think back, and like at that period, it was like, that would have been horrendous for everybody. You would have, but now if my kid walks in or my dog barks, or we've just sort of all figured out that's just part of who we are, and that's part of life. And we're showing our background. This is my home.
This is my home.
We're okay with that. So, that's a great thing. That allows us to bring our whole selves, I think, to our work. The other story that makes me think of is Kelly. If we use her as an example, she's big into tattoos, but for a long time was reluctant to sort of make that visible to her professional community, right? It was something that she sort of said, in my personal life, I'm going to be this person, but when I'm working, I'm going to be this person. And through this last couple of years, she said, you know what, I'm one person. And so now she proudly displays her tats, and there's a lot of people who have sort of come into their own as a result of that. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And that is, again, a lesson I hope we continue to carry forward as we think of the future of leadership, future of work, future of the workplace. And that's not the future. That stuff is here right now.
Yeah. So again, you saw me lean over. That's me jotting down one of those nuggets. And again, this is what I really want people to get out of these podcasts and that's what I was able to do doing this podcast. Like, they enabled me to do this. And this is my whole self. I love talking to people. I love creating content. I love connecting people to other people. And, I sometimes say some things that are a little off the wall, and it's like, that's just me being my whole self. Yeah. I don't, these confines of the workplace. I had a customer, and you'll probably remember these days, you couldn't go to that customer site without having a suit on. Mm-hmm. And it's like, now I have shorts on, it's 90 degrees out and I have shorts on. I have my polo shirt on and all, but to be your whole self, I think is something really, really powerful that you said over the course of this podcast. I really like that.
Well, and thank you for doing the podcast, because you help, every pod that you do helps make that more and more okay. So thank you for doing it. I encourage you to keep doing it because it's such a powerful medium, and it really does allow folks to bring their whole selves into whatever they're doing, talking about, sharing with you. So it's really powerful. And
I really look for that. And that's the perfect segue. And what I like to do at the end of these podcasts is kind of show a little bit of gratitude, especially with people I know. When I started at the company that I'm at today, Nuvolo, I had something I needed help on. And at that point in time, you helped me with it. Whether you knew it was me or not, it was very important to me. And it was something that was important to my career. And it all worked out for the best till today. That relationship that was built with your help is still intact today and continuing strong, and turned out to be the success that I hoped it would be. Without creating any shameless plugs or bringing anybody else into this, I want to show you some gratitude and say thank you for doing that. It meant the world to me and really helped me and an organization that I became friends with work towards a very successful project. And I couldn't have done it without you, Robert.
Thank you for that. That warms my heart. Thank you.
And that's what we do. We, in the corporate real estate, we all know each other. Sales reps compete against each other. Sometimes we end up working for the same companies. We all look out for one another. And I think you're one of the best examples in our industry of somebody who leads by example, who's empathetic and brings us things like this. Let's co-create the solution. Let's have a bias towards action, and let's be our whole selves. Those are my takeaways from this podcast. Did I miss anything?
That's a good list. Thank you for that.
So we're gonna wrap it up there. Robert, I thank you so much for spending this time with us today. I really do appreciate you and your thoughtfulness and your willingness to take the time out of your day. One more time, the name of your company is?
The Integri Group.
And they can find you where?
IntegriGroup.com, or hit me up on my LinkedIn, Robert Teed.
There you go. Everyone, the great Robert Teed, one of the best examples of leadership we have in the corporate real estate industry. That's Connected Conversations. I thank everybody for joining us. We'll see you next time on the interwebs.